Yeah, I won't be talking about vegetables, but Fruity Loops anyway. So, yes, as the title says, from breakbeats to Fruity Loops, let me try to situate it to some extent in what's been going on here the last couple of days. As we've seen and as we've discussed, there are abundant possibilities, of course, for generating all kinds of new sounds these days, as well as working with old sounds. In some sense, what Paul Théberge some time ago called any sound you can imagine, to talk about the possibilities of music technology is our reality today. And yet outside of experimental circles, that is to say in more popular music scenes, as far as I can tell, we actually behold a remarkable commitment to well-worn sounds, to older sounds, and to sounds that are quite cherished and which have taken on very special resonances over the years. Both literal and figurative resonances. And so what I want to explore today is, as I'm calling it, small sounds, and to some extent small scenes, the way that small scenes generate a set of small sounds which have become deeply, deeply resonant for the communities that participate in these scenes, and to some extent also, resonant to outsiders who find themselves attracted to those sounds and to those aesthetics. You probably are familiar with some of these, and I referenced some of them here. One that I mentioned is the ice rink clink. Anybody know that one? If you're into UK grime, you may have heard that before, right? But another one would be the sounds of the Roland 808, which have become utterly ubiquitous. My favorite is I have a few favorites. I like the clave. I really like what they call where is it now? I mean, there's the rim shot, pretty classic, right? Snare drums, of course, the clap, and then where's the cowbell? Oh yes, yeah, cowbell. But despite that, right? And actually, this reminds me of the presentation on FM synthesis. They're kind of going for a cowbell, but it's not really a cowbell. And yet, it's been used brilliantly. It's been developed into such a resonant sound from the early days of electro all the way to today that now we value these sounds very deeply. And in fact, they've become very valuable insofar as you can hear them all over pop music production today. And yet, one of the funny things about the 808, for instance, is as mentioned at the beginning of this fairly trenchant piece about Black lives and technology, is that Roland discontinued this machine in 1984, before it really became taken up by Chicago house producers and hip hop producers and so forth, and it was considered somewhat of a flop. Despite all of these innovations, disappointing sales and a lukewarm critical reception seemed indicators that, in fact, rather than this, digitally sampled drum machines were the future. And so, part of that, I think, suggests to me the amazing ways that producers working with these sounds have, in fact, added value to them, have made them valuable. And in that way, what I want to think about today is how communities have sort of co-produced these new sets of sounds, that have a great deal of resonance and value. In a certain sense, these are kind of informal, sometimes illegal sound banks that circulate, again, informally. They've become a sort of set of genre construction kits by which, with a single sound sometimes, you can signal a whole genre, and by doing so, implicate as well a community that is based on a kind of real-time social co-presence, dancing together to music, for example. So I want to think about more recently, with the advent of the DAW, something like Fruity Loops, that there's also been a sort of move toward these smaller atomized sounds and away from longer loops and so forth. I want to look at a few case studies today to examine the ways that these literal and figurative resonances, right, the way that these sounds have been changed, literally, sonically, as well as the ways that their meanings have been changed, enhanced, value added, and so forth. I want to look at how these things have evolved historically, and also to, of course, listen to them, and then to think about the implications of what it means when those kinds of ways of implicating communities and gesturing to genres become available to anyone with a DAW and access to these samples, which do circulate quite promiscuously in their own way. Not to repeat myself too much, but I want to suggest that the resonance of these things, it's not an immanent resonance. It's not about the sounds themselves, right? It happens in a social process, and it's cultivated through a kind of, again, co-present community repetition and development. So let's get into some of these examples. And before we talk about small sounds and Fruity Loops, I think it makes sense to start with breakbeats. Because it really is initially through the breakbeat and then the later engagement with these breakbeats in the 1980s with the advent of digital samplers that this whole new process, in a certain way, of making music really takes off. So you are probably familiar with the story, but I'll just play you a little bit of this video of Kool Herc explaining his own approach to isolating breakbeats in the South Bronx in the early 1970s, and then we'll tease out a couple themes here.
One night, I'm waiting for the record to play out. I said, I wonder if I put that to myself. I said, if they're waiting for this particular break and I have a couple more records that's got the same breakup in it, I wonder how would it be if I put them all together. And I told them, I said, I'm going to try something new tonight. I'm going to call it a merry-go-round.
Herc's merry-go-round meant that instead of playing whole records, he would play just the instrumental breaks, mixing between them to create a continuous dance rhythm.
I started out with lean down, James Brown, clap your hand, stomp your feet. That part right there, when the break, boom, I had to come in with bongo rock.
Okay, so you get the idea here. I don't know how many of you are already familiar with this story. But it's a very interesting story in lots of ways, the story of Kool Herc more generally. But what he's doing here in the early 1970s is in some ways taking the Jamaican sound system approach to playing recordings live for people, to turning mediated music into immediate musical experience. But he's translating that for a Bronx crowd, meaning he's not playing reggae records for one, right? What he's doing more is taking the sort of core conceptual approaches of the reggae sound system and realizing that in this new context where the records instead that he's playing are these ones that have breaks in them. As he even says, the same break up in it. And it's not exactly the same break, but it's essentially, the James Brown beat. It's that kind of funk rhythm. And so he starts to isolate these passages and to some extent, just play only these breaks over and over again, right? So that's something also that comes out of the Jamaican sound system approach. There's not exactly a respect for the integrity of this record that you must play it from start to end or something like that. In fact, it's seen instead as a kind of raw material to be activated in the context of a live, real-time, co-present situation. It's a way of making sociality. And yet what I want to suggest too here is that his choices about what to play aren't just because he's an attentive DJ and an innovative DJ and so forth, but because he's paying attention to what people want to hear. He's paying attention to the fact that a community of dancers have already decided that these are the exciting records, and in fact that they only want to hear these passages from the records. And so this is a community process, right? We don't want to just focus on the DJ. We certainly don't want to just focus on the musicians on the record. We want to focus on the dancers as well and think about how together they produce what emerges by the end of the 1970s as a kind of canon of breakbeats that are quite central to what is emerging as hip-hop as a genre. Now, some interesting thing happens between the 70s and, say, the mid-1980s when digital samplers actually make it possible to go back and sample from that canon. From about 1979 to about 1984, to do what he's doing with these breaks, looping them or extending them in that way, would have been, quite difficult, technologically speaking. So, for example, in 1979, when Sugar Hill Records puts out Rapper's Delight, they're playing, it's based on a loop from Chic's Good Times, but it's replayed by a band, right? It's not from the record. And in fact, when Sylvia Robinson approaches Grandmaster Flash prior to that, seeing if he wants to put out the first hip-hop record, it doesn't even make any sense to him. He says, hip-hop is me playing records, all night to a crowd. You want me to play records on a record? That doesn't exactly make sense. And of course, for the first few years in the 1980s, most of the productions are, based on synthesizers, drum machines, that kind of thing. But an interesting development comes along, which is, of course, the advent of the digital sampler. And I want to just call attention to this sort of seminal moment when DJ Marley Marl discovers the possibilities of this. And he's saying it was in 81 or 82. He wanted to sample a voice from this song with the emulator he was using, and accidentally a snare went through. At first I was like, that's the wrong thing, but then it was sounding good. I kept running back and hitting the emulator. Then I looked at the engineer and said, you know what this means? I could take any drum sound from an old record, put it in here, and get the old drummer sound on some shit. No more of that dull DMX shit, right? So he wasn't that into these attempts by drum machines to make drums. He wanted James Brown's drums, right? He wanted those snares and those kick drums and those hi-hats that DJs had been playing in the Bronx, for 10, almost 15 years at this point. And so there's this. He starts to sample records, and that has some very interesting consequences. Let me show you. So he explains a little bit about this process here.
You love to hear the story again and again of how it all got started way back when. Marley Marl is right in your face. Classic Recipes is right in the place.
Oh my God, I think I'm having a rap attack.
In control, in control, in control. Golden Era Radio.
When I first met MC Shan and he came to the House of Hits at my house in Queensbridge, he had the Marley scratch written on a napkin.
All of his beats and my rhymes attached. From the new creation called the Marley scratch. We're always steered at a positive course. His beats, my rhymes combine made force.
Before Shan started making records, he was known as a freestyle king on 12th Street in Queensbridge. The track The Bridge was made not to be a record, it was made for intermission music at the Queensbridge Festival that we had in Queensbridge Park in 1984. Now the first time the track played, everybody's heads turned. Everybody was like, wow, it's a song about Queensbridge. Everybody was like, play it again, play it again. It was so popular that day when we played it in the park. One of my nephews took the tape and spread it throughout Queensbridge. Everybody in Queensbridge had a copy of that song, and it wasn't a record yet. I had to do something about that.
Right. So obviously he then kind of gets the idea, well, this could be commercially viable. Let me actually press this up as a record. But let's note before that, he says that wasn't the original intention. It was made for this community event, right? It was made originally more for use value than for exchange value, right? In the same way that what Kool Herc was doing, even if he was charging 25 cents to get into his dances, was again about a community event. It wasn't exactly a sort of commodity that he was thinking about at this time. So Marley Marl tells the story of producing this track, and I want to just go to a couple more minutes of it. He uses an 808 to trigger the samples that he takes from an old record called Impeach the President. Very timely record to think about today. That's this one. And you see it starts off with this lovely, unadorned drum break, perfect for a DJ. You don't have to go searching for it. You just start the needle right at the beginning. You have 4 measures, 8.
They just got back from Washington, D.C. I think they got something they want to say.
Okay, so let me let him tell that story here for a second. Yes. One more.
As you already know, this record became a hit, but a lot of responses came out from people who thought that we was talking about hip-hop started in Queensbridge, especially from people in the Bronx. Boogie Down Production came out with South Bronx, South Bronx.
South Bronx, the South Bronx, South Bronx, the South Bronx.
So you know we had to go back in the lab and come with something else. We came with Kill That Noise.
South Bronx,
Kill that noise.
South Bronx.
Kill that noise.
So one thing that's happening here, as you can hear, is that they're sampling each other as part of this rivalry. So on the one hand, there's MC Shan and the Juice Crew representing Queensbridge, and then Boogie Down Productions from the Boogie Down Bronx come out and say, no, kill that noise. It's about the Bronx. It's not about Queensbridge. And the way that they actually, this battle ensues is through direct kind of sampling of each other's songs. But it gets even richer than that. Oh, gosh, no, that's not the right thing. How'd I get out of there? Okay, sorry. Here we are.
They came with The Bridge Is Over.
That's it. The bridge is over. The bridge is over. Bye-bye. The bridge is over. The bridge is over.
The funny story about The Bridge Is Over is that I had met BDP for the first time at Power Play Studios when they was playing their demos for Mr. Magic. Mr. Magic was my partner.
Good evening to your super listeners. How you doing tonight?
He was the voice, I was the DJ on the world famous Mr. Magic Rap Attack that was on WBLS back in the day. Now the Rap Attack was the first commercial rap radio show in the world, and everybody wanted to get down. Well, that night, Boogie Down Production wanted Mr. Magic to hear their demo, so he went in the room. The music was very loud. He did not like it at all, so it got really heated. In a rush to vacate the studio, I forgot my famous drum reel with all my drum sounds on them. Fast forward, I'm listening to the radio and I hear a song called The Bridge Is Over, utilizing my drum sounds.
My drum sounds, right?
I was like, yo, that sounds like my drum sounds. Who's that? That's them kids that Magic dissed in the studio the other day. The Bridge Is Over was made using my drum sounds that I left at Power Play Studios. Every producer knows their drum sounds. It has something to do with the needle going over the plastic with a certain amount of crackle on each kick. Hear that? That's what I'm talking about.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, all right, so there's some very interesting stuff that emerges here. I mean, first of all, the whole idea of stealing his drum, I mean, that's really wild. But also the idea that he also feels a kind of ownership of these things by virtue of simply sampling it off his own record, right? He says, oh, it's got this sort of patina, you know, of the particular little crackles and pops on it. Those are my drum sounds, right? He doesn't necessarily care about whether the band that recorded this song, you know, has some sense of ownership over it. And in fact, that's pretty consistent in a way with, you know, ethics, sampling ethics in hip hop. This is from Joe Schloss's wonderful book, Making Beats, where he looks into different forms of sampling ethics and different sort of unwritten rules among producers. One of the biggest ones being no biting. One cannot sample material that's been recently used by someone else. Now, of course, the story we just saw is the exact opposite of that, which makes some sense here. But you know, one of the interesting things about here that he notes here is that biting is used throughout the hip-hop world, referring pejoratively to the appropriation of intellectual material from other hip-hop artists. Generally speaking, it does not apply to the appropriation of material from outside the hip-hop community. Again, this supports the general idea of ethics as being responsive to community needs. The concerns of outsiders are not an issue. This is a more general theme in my talk today, so I will come back to it. But just to sort of underscore it, so here's Impeach the President. Listen to that snare sound. Very particular timbre, you know, was generated by that particular drummer playing on that particular drum kit in that particular room with that particular set of recording equipment, right? And of course, on whatever record this was pressed up on. And here's Marley Marl's The Bridge. Listen for the snare. Okay. Here's BDP's The Bridge Is Over. Back again. You get the idea, right? Same drum sounds being used together, and what starts to happen in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, is that hip-hop producers go back to that canon of records that was selected by the DJs and by the dancers in the 1970s, and start to, you know, rebuild that canon in their sample-based productions, because those sounds still have such a resonance for listeners. Now, those efforts were aided and abetted by a guy named Breakbeat Lou, who reissued many of these records, many of which would have been a little bit more obscure and hard to find. You know, as you may or may not know, hip-hop DJs did a good job of trying to maintain a certain kind of exclusivity over their records and so forth. But in the mid to late 80s, Breakbeat Lou starts to issue a whole 25 compilations known as Ultimate Beats and Breaks, including Impeach the President, and records like Amen Brother that got referenced yesterday, which became very quickly one of the more commonly sampled breaks in hip-hop, as well as, of course, in jungle and drum and bass. And just want to show you, you know, this is what the cover would look like. Sometimes these were even issued as doubles so that DJs could use them. But really what this did is it provided these samples of these breaks to all kinds of listeners. It also did an interesting thing, though, in that Breakbeat Lou would sometimes make edits of these things, often to facilitate their sampling. So sometimes that might mean putting the break in the beginning of the song instead of in the middle. And in other cases, in the case of the Amen break, actually, it meant actually slowing down the break so that it was more at hip-hop rapping speed than at the up-tempo speed at which the Winstons originally played it. So Amen Brother, if you look at the waveform here, you know, it's a pretty loud, brassy, sort of jazz funk version of a gospel song. And then there's this wonderful break in the middle. Listen to the version from Ultimate Beats and Breaks and what happens here. Huh? Weird, right? So obviously you wouldn't play this record as such, right? That wouldn't make any sense at all. It's really just to be sampled. And in fact, you know, when you listen to those drums at that speed, and it changes the pitch as well, that's the same exact speed and pitch that, you know, Mantronix samples it, that NWA samples it, and of course that then it gets chopped and rearranged by all of these jungle producers a few years later. So, you know, again, I just want to call attention to sort of how many actors are involved in producing these sounds that ultimately become these very powerful, brief, you know, sonic signifiers. Let's shift to another genre so that we can explore how this happens in another community context. And that genre in this case is reggaeton, which if you don't know, is a genre that kind of emerges quite transnationally. You know, you could talk about Jamaica's role and Panama's role and the role of New York City and of course San Juan, Puerto Rico. And in all of those cases, we have, you know, listening communities interacting with DJs and then also with producers and vocalists to ultimately produce the dembow rhythm. So let me show you how the dembow rhythm emerges and then how it has been used since then. Initially, we have Shabba Ranks' record Dembow from 1991.
That's bad. I'm about to see me off with you. Ain't no submission, baby, like no bone cat to go dirty. That's the liberty. Dembow, 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 dembow. Man on the table, me say that him bow. Girl a clean rifle, me say that she bow. At least big out, and me know a girl bow.
Okay, I'm going to have to set aside all the things he's talking about right now, which we could talk about quite a bit. But let's focus on the rhythm, the underlying beat that's propelling his performance here. This was produced by Steely and Clevie, two really classic producers, dancehall producers from Jamaica. And this song, you know, pretty quickly became became a hit among reggae listening audiences in Jamaica and, of course, in the diaspora, in Panama and in New York City. And it was in New York City where a group of Jamaicans working in a studio in Long Island at Philip Smart's studio had started to get into the practice of recording Spanish language cover versions of the most contemporary dancehall reggae hits as a way of covering the Spanish language market. There was a clear interest in dancehall reggae among all the Spanish-speaking people in New York, and these Jamaicans, in collaboration with Panamanians, who were as descendants of Jamaicans who went there, in the early part of the 20th century to work on the canal, they were among the first practitioners to start doing dancehall reggae in Spanish, and they did direct covers. So here is Nando Boom singing his version of Shabba Ranks' Dembow, and you'll hear the underlying musical accompaniment is very similar. It's not the same. It's being replayed by a band on different equipment, and it sounds like this.
¿Bokia? Yes, man. Voy a decirlo vulgarmente. Todos esos mamones que se echen para atrás y esas mamonas. Iris, dembow, 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 dembow. Hombre con zapata de ese zumbo. Alza la mano si no vende zumbo. Gritando fuerte no vende zumbo. Hombre con zapata de ese zumbo. Gritando fuerte no vende zumbo.
Okay, you get the idea? You hear the relationship? Hopefully. And so what happens is that they issue a version of this song with the instrumental on the B-side, right? And that's a classic practice. It had actually begun in Jamaica with the idea that these were records that weren't complete just to be played at home, that they were, again, raw materials to be activated in a DJ context. So that's why you would put the version or the rhythm or the instrumental on the other side. Although later when I interviewed the producer of the session, he referred to it as a bad custom of the Jamaicans to just let that go out like that, because then anybody can use it. And at this point, of course, he understood that this thing he was involved in producing had become such a common reference point for reggaeton that it probably underpins somewhere like 3/4 of all reggaeton songs. Here's the instrumental as played by the keyboardist Dennis the Menace. Now, if you compare that to the Steely and Clevey version, it's quite different in a lot of ways, and they've added a few little touches, including that little sort of drum roll toward the end of the measure, the which they interpreted initially as a kind of way of adding some Latin sabor to the proceedings. But if you go to, if you listen to any reggaeton, or for that matter, if you pick up, a collection of pistas famosas de reggaeton, tres, or dos, or uno, you will see that there's at least one dembow on there. Sometimes there's several dembos on there, and the one that's labeled dembow original sounds like this. Okay, now let me toggle this with Dennis the Menace so you can hear. Pretty similar, right? Yeah, the same, kind of, right? I mean, there are some slight timbral differences. This later one has clearly been kind of remastered many times, right? It's been run through the mill of a whole community chopping this loop and using it for many, many years. And so we can definitely hear the relationship there, but the resonances have changed, both literally and figuratively. And this became a loop that, again, would be used on all kinds of productions at the time. So just to sort of take us back there for a second, here is a video from 1996 of The Noise Collective, one of the main San Juan-based collectives. It's a bit of a mixtape, but you'll hear, again, a real collage aesthetic. These were producers originally inspired by hip-hop sample-based approach, but they started gravitating much more toward dancehall reggae samples as a way of giving their music a kind of Caribbean tinge, I believe. Anyway, listen for the dembo. See if you can hear when it comes in. Obviously, we're not in Puerto Rico anymore. Yeah? It starts with a hip-hop beat, but then sort of minimal dancehall reggae. Wait for it. Okay, now there's a lot of layers in there. There's a lot going on. But if you listen closely, you can hear the dembo underneath. You can hear some of the distinctive little drum rolls and things in there. And so over this process in the 1990s of these producers making these very dense collages, but essentially relying on a very small number of central samples, there's a whole sort of canon produced for the reggaeton audience. And back in 2004, after I had come back from Jamaica where I was doing my dissertation research and I was back in Boston, I started offering Fruity Loops workshops to young people in Boston and in greater Boston. And that's actually where I first really encountered reggaeton, because I'd be sitting with a Puerto Rican student. I'd say, well, do you want to make a hip hop beat? Do you want to make a reggae beat? And they'd say, oh, Spanish reggae. And I'd say, Spanish reggae? Well, here's how to make a reggae beat, and then you can rap in Spanish over it. And they're like, no, Spanish reggae. And I was like, well, what do you mean? You know, and so he played me some reggaeton, and that was the beginning of quite a journey for myself. But it also showed me that there was this huge world of a very particular approach to making dancehall in Puerto Rico. And eventually I ran into some kids who were trading, these samples and circulating these sample banks where, it would include things like the dembo kick, right? Sounds familiar? Or various kick drums. Here's another dembo kick. You know what, while we're here, let me just bring this up here. Boom. And where's this one? Yeah, that's a nice kick. And then what I was most struck by, though, was how many, let's see, old hi-hat. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, that's good. And how many snares? Look at all the snares. Sando. Right? Many of them named after the songs from which they've been sampled, reggaeton songs, that is, right? Even if originally they were from a reggae song from Jamaica, they've now been given these other names. And again, it's this process of sampling samples that have been sampled over and over again. Once you have that kind of a thing, it's very simple. Let's see. Now, why isn't that playing? Why isn't that one playing? I don't know. Instant reggaeton. You don't need too much. Once you've got the samples, you know the patterns, it all comes together. And in fact, even when reggaeton experienced its first, popular heyday with Daddy Yankee's Gasolina, you can actually hear that the producers, Looney Tunes, sort of maintain an allegiance to that older approach by shifting the snare samples. Instead of shifting whole breaks now, we've just shifted to these particular snare samples that, index those breaks. So listen to Gasolina one more time. But listen for the snares. Let me fast forward a bit here. All right, now watch the snare. New snare, right? When I first noticed that, it was really striking because you don't generally hear a different snare drum in the same song, right? I mean, obviously that wouldn't work in a band. You wouldn't have two different snare drums. And even in hip hop, you don't generally have two different snare drums in the song. And it took a while for me to figure out that this was this sort of vestige of this earlier moment in sort of reggaeton history. But eventually you get this, this canon of samples from what was once a canon of breaks, and that allows people to very quickly make something that indexes reggaeton and implicates this whole community that helped to produce it. So, for example, in the one of the most recent reggaeton hits, J Balvin's Mi Gente, when we get to the chorus, you hear a couple things. You hear the dembo tra. Yeah, let me see. I didn't play you that one, but this the tra is this. I didn't name that. Listen for it here.
La fiesta la llevo en mis genes. Yo soy la reina
de los nenes.
Mi música los tiene fuerte bailando y se baila así.
Hear it? Hear it? Ooh. The other thing that you hear at the chorus is that that hi-hat, which in fact comes from the fever pitch rhythm. Right? Fever pitch is another one of these very popular dancehall reggae rhythms that was used in a lot of reggaeton, and it's the same thing that Diplo used when he wanted to give a little lift to lean on. Hear it? So this is one example where, Diplo can produce a huge hit that borrows from the power of reggaeton and borrows from that whole community process that generated it, simply with the use of a hi-hat in a particular pattern. Okay, I'm running low on time, so I'm going to give you one more example that's maybe a little bit more trenchant in terms of how it all plays out, especially as these sounds escape the direct community in the circle community and go to the outside. And that is the ballroom or Vogue scene, really based in New York City, but has other outposts elsewhere. And in the 1990s, this was a scene that was oftentimes gathered around the use of one particular record, Masters at Work's The Ha Dance. Whoops, it's faster than that. Okay, you get the idea. And now this was used over and over and over again. If you read this story by Vivian Host, Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Ha, she talks about that history, the fact that this was the main track used, and then she talks about this turn that happens around 2000 or so, when a producer named Vijwan Allure starts to produce his own versions of the Ha. And this younger producer, Mike Q, says, just about all the tracks I've made are Ha's, maybe 90% of them. Vijwan Allure says at least 350 to 400 Ha's they've produced over the years. This is an example of Mike Q doing it. And you'll hear the Ha pretty soon. Hear it? Real quick, wait. That's it. But if you know it, you know it. Now, just quickly, this has a very strange origin if you're not familiar with it, which is in fact the movie Trading Places with Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy, and in fact a strange blackface scene.
I certainly hope there's enough space on the train for me. Nenge Yomboko from Cameroon. Do you remember me? It's Lionel Joseph.
Lionel! From the African Education Conference, right?
Yes, I was director of cultural events at the Haile Selassie Pavilion.
I remember the pavilion. We had big fun there.
So that's it. I mean, definitely a whimsical choice on the part of Masters at Work, right, to produce that. And also kind of a little odd that it becomes such a reference point for the Vogue, ballroom scene. And again, you can hear hundreds of songs that use this. But it's quite, there's a lot of debate in this scene about what it means when Vogue as a dance or as a musical style goes outside of the community, or when it becomes brogue, like the bro step of Vogue. And there was this point, recently, that Mike Q noticed that Apple put out this commercial.
Sweet home Alabama.
So I don't know how obvious it is, but this is essentially a Ha track as well. produced by a white Frenchman. Right? So Mike Q says, oh, so Apple's using Haas now, you know, what's going on with that? And obviously there's some controversy around it in the same way that, you know, using Wiley's ice rink sample, you know, might be seen as a circle jerk among a new generation of producers who aren't involved in the scene at all. I just want to sort of come to a close here by noting an argument that Gavin Mueller brings in this wonderful piece about CVS bangers, but about trap music, trap EDM more generally. And he notes that music styles that, like hip-hop, are connected to some kind of grassroots are fluid, with constant incremental changes building into epical ones. When they move from their base audience, it's also because a particular conjuncture of sounds resonates with a new crowd. But here's where a kind of misrecognition occurs. For the neophytes, the style is this one way, frozen in time. The give and take between music makers and their core followings, which I hope I've elaborated here today, the push and pull, ebb and flow that built disco, hip-hop, house, reggaeton, and so on, is interrupted by listeners who, in their enthusiasm, don't always understand the history or sociology of their genres. They don't have to. When music becomes a commodity, it can travel worldwide, as all commodities do, severed from any knowledge of the conditions of its production. Genres cease to be grassroots social worlds and instead become something more like brands, mere sonic surfaces rather than deep historical processes. When a genre develops a signature sound, it's ripe for the plucking by interlopers. Instead of having any real connection to the communities that develop musical styles through the dialectical movement between music makers and their core audiences, an outside producer just has to have a decent set of ears and a computer and can start cranking out reasonable facsimiles. And then, you know, he comes back to this point that this one sample that happens in a lot of trap songs, damn son, where'd you find that? He says the answer is always the same, you downloaded it off the internet. And he finishes, well, he doesn't finish right, but he then quotes a DJ, Rizla DJ, who says, flips it around and says, damn son, put that back where you found it. And I guess, you know, I'll just sort of close things here by saying, you know, one of the interesting things that we maybe can contrast with Marley Marl felt a kind of personal ownership over those sounds that he had sampled. And also we can imagine that, you know, a band like the Winstons might have also felt a kind of individual ownership over the sound that they had generated. With regard to reggaeton, or with regard to the ha dance and these smaller samples that become the new kind of canon, we maybe perceive more of a collective ownership over it, you know, within the circle, as opposed to a kind of right to individual exploitation. And yet, once these things become so kind of condensed into a single small sound, it's quite easy, as I hope I've demonstrated, for anybody to go ahead and make music in a genre that implicates this whole community. Now, what's the implication for this for the future sound of pop music? Well, I guess I would imagine, although I'm not really much of a prognosticator, but based on the history, that the future sound of pop music will continue to be a very profoundly collectively shaped thing. And hopefully, although I have no historical evidence that this will be the case, a more equitably exploited and shared, you know, sort of thing as well. But again, you know, history suggests that's not the way it's going to go. Thank you.